So, within the past year, there's been a lot of discussion on art regression, and it's become especially rampant on Art Talk when people do comparison videos with their old art and new art, and if the stylistic change is incredibly different, it's usually a bunch of comments going that, oh yeah, your art regressed, whatever. But while that isn't entirely what I'm here to talk about, I do mention it a little bit. I do want to discuss how that mentality has kind of shaped other artists, myself included, because I feel like I'm a little bit of a victim to thinking that way, that as soon as my art doesn't look the way that I like, I immediately think it's regression, and then that leads to a bunch of art block. So, do take everything that I say with a grain of salt before I begin anything, because everyone's artist experience is different, and this is entirely based off of personal experience and how my art has developed over time. So, with all of that out of the way, as the title states, I don't think it's art regression that I'm actually dealing with in most of these cases, but rather an art numbness. And I think I actually have to describe what I mean by art numbness, but to break it down into simple terms, I guess what I consider art numbness is when one is so used to the way that their art looks that when it's slightly different, that it just kind of throws them off, and then they immediately attribute it to regression. And that isn't the case, because I think in a lot of these there's actual improvement, but you can't exactly see that when you're comparing it to all of your recent works, because you're only looking at your improvement on such a small scale. You know what I mean? I had this issue where it was just a cycle where I was happy with where my art style was, and when it started to diverge from what I was used to, I freaked out because I thought it was regression or that my art style quality was deteriorating. I stopped producing a lot more art and scrapping, evidently, a lot more stuff. And then it's just kind of a bumpy road from there, and slowly starting to develop more art again. And I feel like after that rough period, I'm able to flourish in my art again. And this was a reoccurring thing for me. I think there was a couple ways that I've come to cure this art numbness, so to speak. So the three things that I think cure art numbness is redraws, reflections, and re-inspiring yourself. So I'll always recommend people redraw their old art, and it's probably one of those things that I do really often because I love to see how my art has developed over time linearly. So there's a couple artworks that I redraw every year or two, and I think that's helped me a lot understand just how much I've grown, even though I don't see it immediately. It's a lot easier to see the bigger picture when you're zooming out and looking at all of your old art. That leads into the reflections section of this, which is related to the redraw bit but without the drawing. I think it's really nice to go back to your original art, and I mean like your really, really old art, because I don't think looking at something a couple months ago compared to now is enough of a difference. So, especially when you're going through a really rough art numbness area, it's really helpful to go back to the beginnings of everything and then just slowly go through everything from there. That helps me understand that my art is improving, that I just can't see it because I'm so used to the way my art looks now, and that whatever's coming next is going to be an improvement from the last. I think the last thing that I've talked about is becoming re-inspired with your artwork, and to realize that divergence from what you're usually drawing isn't necessarily a bad thing, and sometimes it's really fun to play into all of those differences. And I found that's the way that I've slowly evolved my art style, is to get into a point where even though I'm not exactly comfortable with this style, I can play around with it, and even if it doesn't actualize in the end, I'll still have gained something from it that can be applied later in the future. even then, after all of this, I don't think that any of this is regression when you're seeing your artwork quality fluctuate in specific points in time. If anything, what I've come to realize is when my art quality tends to go on a downward slope, it's mostly because I'm actually slowly transitioning into a new art style. When I was having really rough patches with my art style maybe 2 years ago, when I just felt like I couldn't draw at all, it was just a matter of my art style not being compatible with myself anymore, and that there was time to start something new. And it was a slow build up to the point I'm at now, and while there's some similarities in my art style from previous artworks, there's still a lot of additions that came because I overcame those really difficult portions of art block and art numbness, essentially. So no, you're not regressing. It's just that you don't see your improvement because you're going through a point in time when you're transitioning into something new. And while you don't see that now, I think it's important to look back at where you began and where you are now. And I think it'll make all the more difference and get you remotivated in doing your art. I hope this helps even just a little bit. Again, this isn't applicable to everyone, but for the very few sliver of people, you know. So yeah.